They told you the Civil War was about freedom, about states and slavery. But what if I told you that buried beneath Tennessee soil lies a truth so vile, so systemically engineered? It makes the battlefield look merciful. In the summer of 1863, as cannon fire shook Gettysburg, the Chamberlain family was orchestrating something quieter, deadlier. Workers vanished, whole families erased, and no one dared to speak. Until now, you've been taught to look to DC and Richmond for your history. But the real power, the real control, it was hidden behind white columns and blood-soaked ledgers. This isn't just a tale of a cotton dynasty. It's the blueprint of psychological control, financial manipulation, mass disappearance, and chemical annihilation. Long before words like genocide ever made it to textbooks. They called it Rosewood Manor. But this was no house. It was a machine, a harvest engine, one that didn't just process cotton. It processed lives. Workers were offered generous wages, contracts, hope, and then disappeared. Not escaped, not conscripted, dissolved. Every trace gone. Their belongings catalogued, their labor absorbed into fortunes, and their existence wiped as clean as their records. What we're about to uncover will not only expose the Chamberlain dynasty, it will reveal the machinery of elite power you were never meant to see. Keep watching, because by the time this story ends, you won't just understand the corruption behind Rosewood. You'll understand the system still operating today, more polished, more digital, but no less deadly. And if that scares you, good. It should. The descent begins now. Rosewood Manor didn't begin as a house of horrors. That was its brilliance. That was its camouflage. From a distance, it looked like paradise. Grand Corinthian columns, acres of fertile cotton fields, French chandeliers hanging from the ceilings like crystalline stars. The kind of place Southern dreams were built on. But dreams, as you'll come to see, are often purchased with nightmares. Ezekiel Chamberlain inherited the plantation from his father Josiah. But he inherited more than land. He inherited an ideology, one masked in civility, yet rooted in absolute control. To outsiders, Ezekiel was the portrait of a Southern gentleman, educated, poised, calculating. But beneath the polished veneer was a man obsessed with profit, secrecy, and order, no matter the cost. As the Civil War fractured Tennessee, other plantations collapsed under economic strain. But not Rosewood. While others lost their enslaved laborers, Ezekiel made a bold move. He offered wages, contracts, a chance at dignity. Former slaves, destitute white laborers, displaced craftsmen, all drawn in by promises of stability in a world gone mad. But what none of them realized was that the very contracts they signed were shackles in ink. Workers disappeared. Not in the dead of night, not by force, but systematically. One by one. Their departures were explained with perfect paperwork, theft, drunkenness, breach of contract. The kind of accusations that stick, even posthumously. No one asked questions, because questions were dangerous. Ezekiel didn't need a whip. He had something far more powerful, trust. And when trust is weaponized by the elite, it becomes the deadliest tool of all. As the months passed and graves multiplied in the woods behind the plantation, the illusion of Rosewood's prosperity remained untouched. Because no one wanted to see what was hiding in plain sight. Not yet. The truth began to unravel when Sheriff Coleman Briggs received a quiet knock at his door. It was November 1862. Rain dripped from the eaves of his Murfreesboro office, and in stepped Martha Henley, trembling, eyes hollow, gripping a photograph of her brother like it was a holy relic. Thomas Henley had vanished. A blacksmith, honest, sober since their father died from drink. He'd taken a job at Rosewood Manor 6 weeks earlier, lured by promises of fair pay. But he never wrote, never came home. Martha's story hit Briggs like a slow, sour chill. She'd ridden to the plantation herself, only to be turned away by Daniel Chamberlain, Ezekiel's eldest son. The explanation? Thomas had broken his contract, caught drunk, dismissed without pay. But Briggs knew Thomas. So did half the county. He was the kind of man people relied on, the kind that didn't vanish. So the sheriff rode out to Rosewood, and there stood Ezekiel on the steps, ledger in hand, story prepared, witnesses lined up, everything too convenient, too clean, like it had been rehearsed 100 times. But it was the smell that stayed with Briggs, not sweat, not livestock, chemicals, something acidic, like the tannery but sharper. It clung to the air around the outbuildings like a ghost refusing to leave. 3 days later, Martha's body was pulled from the Stones River. Drowned, they said. Her horse found calmly grazing on the bank. No signs of violence, no signs of struggle. Just gone. But her bag was missing. And so was the photo of Thomas she always carried. Briggs didn't say a word. Not then. But something inside him shifted. That quiet moment when you realize you're staring into a darkness so wide, it swallows entire lives. By the spring of 1863, the Chamberlain dynasty was thriving. Cotton yields at Rosewood surpassed pre-war numbers. Union and Confederate officers alike were buying from Ezekiel, who played both sides with surgical precision. But what no one could explain, what everyone ignored, was how Rosewood maintained its labor force when every other plantation was begging for workers. It wasn't just Thomas Henley. It was James Patterson, a carpenter from Shelbyville. Gone. It was Eleanora Walsh, an Irish seamstress, last seen smiling with a carpet bag. Gone. It was Isaac Freeman, his wife Ruth, and their sons Jacob and Benjamin. A whole family vanished after accepting jobs at Rosewood. Sheriff Briggs investigated every time. And every time, Ezekiel had answers. Detailed logs, signed contracts, disciplinary reports from credible witnesses. Always too perfect. No contradictions, no gaps. As if reality itself had been edited. But it wasn't just paper manipulation. It was psychological warfare. The Chamberlains didn't rule by fear. They ruled by perception. Rosewood was a beacon, an oasis of order in a world of chaos. If workers left, it was their fault. If they vanished, they were unstable. If they died, they simply never existed. This was institutional gaslighting, pre-modern psychological control. And it worked. No one wanted to believe that a respected plantation family, old money, church-going, socially untouchable, was orchestrating disappearances. But that's the genius of elite corruption. It doesn't hide. It thrives in plain sight because no one dares look directly at it. As Sheriff Briggs pieced together the pattern, a horrifying realization formed. These weren't isolated incidents. They were operations, systematic, engineered. And if 73 people had truly vanished, there was no telling how many more would follow. In early March 1863, Josiah Creek began to notice the numbers weren't adding up. Creek wasn't just another overseer. He'd worked Rosewood soil for nearly 3 decades. He'd survived the sweltering summers, the yellow fever outbreaks, the endless labor that made men forget they had names. He'd seen cruelty, delivered it even. But what was happening now? It unsettled him in a way nothing ever had. Officially, there were 67 workers on the plantation. But when Creek walked the fields, counted the backs bent under the sun, he could only find 39. He didn't say anything at first. Men lied on paper all the time. But then he started watching at night. That's when he saw them. Daniel and Samuel Chamberlain, the twin sons, moving like shadows through the quarters between 2 and 3 a.m. Always with them. 2 pale strangers, quiet, methodical, carrying satchels too fine for farm work. Surgical tools, Creek guessed. Their steps were too clean, too deliberate, like doctors who had found a new kind of patient. After each visit, a worker would vanish. The quarters scrubbed, the belongings gone, as if they'd never been there. Creek kept a journal. Each night, he recorded what he saw, the names, the lantern movements, the scent of chemicals, and the growing weight in his gut that told him this wasn't just about profit anymore. This was ritualistic. This was removal. He didn't confront Ezekiel. Not yet, because Creek wasn't stupid. You don't survive on a place like Rosewood for 30 years by being bold. You survive by being observant and knowing when to disappear yourself. But inside, something old was beginning to fracture. For the first time, Josiah Creek wasn't sure if he was an overseer anymore, or a witness to something monstrous. On a thick, humid night in April 1863, Josiah Creek made a decision that would haunt every breath he took until the day he died. He followed them. The Chamberlain twins moved like ghosts through the quarters, Daniel with his nervous hands twitching at the edges of his coat, and Samuel, shoulders squared like a butcher anticipating meat. Their lanterns cast long swinging shadows against the clapboard cabins as they reached the door of Benjamin Carver, a recent hire, and the only man brave, or foolish, enough to ask what happened to the missing. Benjamin had been vocal, careful, but persistent, asking the other workers why so many vanished, why the numbers didn't match the mouths in the mess hall. He was kind, but no fool, which made him dangerous. Creek watched as the door to Benjamin's cabin closed behind the brothers. 20 silent minutes passed. Then they emerged, dragging a heavy canvas sack between them. Dark stains bled through the fabric. The sack shifted in a way that told Creek it wasn't just tools or trash. They didn't go to the family cemetery. They passed it. Into the woods. Creek followed from the tree line, keeping to the undergrowth, heart pounding in his ears. Ahead, beyond the oak grove, he saw them. Not just the twins, but Ezekiel and the two pale strangers, who now moved with ritualistic precision. One held a torch, the other a bottle of clear fluid that shimmered unnaturally in the firelight. They opened a pre-dug pit and began to pour. No prayers, no words, just chemical silence and the sound of something human dissolving into the soil. Creek gripped the bark of a tree like it was the last thing tethering him to sanity. This wasn't punishment. This was execution. Creek didn't sleep that night. He returned to his cabin just before dawn, shoes soaked in dew, hands still trembling. For the first time in his life, he felt genuinely afraid, not of pain or death, but of knowledge. He now understood something he wished he hadn't. This wasn't about labor. It wasn't about cotton or war profiteering or even race. What the Chamberlains were doing was bigger, more precise, more purposeful. The victims weren't random. They were chosen, filtered, removed. Later that week, Creek tried to speak to Ezekiel directly. He waited until the master was alone on the wraparound gallery, sipping his morning coffee with that eerie calmness. "Sir," Creek began, voice graveling through hesitation, "I've been noticing." Ezekiel didn't even turn to face him. "Josiah," he interrupted smoothly, "you've served this family loyally for years. I trust you understand that some matters are above your station." Creek stiffened. "But I will offer you this," Ezekiel continued, his eyes still fixed on the fields beyond. "The world is changing. Most men will be crushed beneath the weight of that change. But not us. Not those willing to do what's necessary." He finally turned, and Creek saw it in his eyes. Not madness, not fear, but clarity. Cold, absolute, like staring into a frozen lake with something unspeakable beneath the surface. "You've always been valuable to this family," Ezekiel added. "I trust you'll remain so." It wasn't a threat. It was an oath. That night, Creek burned his journal. He buried the ashes in a grove where no cotton grew. Because even though he had seen the truth, he now understood the rule. Survival depends on silence. But somewhere deep inside, something else had been born. A rebellion, a crack. And cracks always spread. By summer, the disappearances escalated. It was no longer every few weeks. It was weekly, then every few days. And the profiles of the missing grew eerily consistent. Strong backs, sharp minds, solitary lives. People with no close kin, no paper trails. No one to miss them but the wind. The Chamberlains had refined the process. First came the lure, Generous contracts, room and board, a handshake from Ezekiel himself. Next came the monitoring. Who asked questions? Who kept to themselves? Who pushed back against the system? Then came the night dot, the pale men, the satchels, the torchlight dot. And finally, the pit dot. What Ezekiel and his sons were doing wasn't chaos. It was clinical, industrial. They weren't murdering for pleasure. They were harvesting. Erasing dot. Some whispered that Daniel had studied chemistry in university before the war, that he'd corresponded with doctors in Richmond, that Samuel had once been seen unloading barrels marked corrosive, not for internal use, near the tannery shed dot. No one knew what those chemicals were, but when the smell came drifting through the cotton rows, everyone worked faster, heads down, lungs burning dot. The scariest part wasn't the killings dot. It was the obedience dot. No revolts, no screams, no open graves dot. Because the workers at Rosewood Manor had learned the ultimate truth. If you speak, you disappear. If you resist, you dissolve dot. Fear wasn't enforced. It was engineered through contract clauses, false accusations, and manufactured shame dot. And yet, something was changing. Beneath the silence, small fractures formed. Workers whispered in the fields, huddled closer at night, counting each other by lantern light dot. One by one, they realized the same thing. They were next dot. And once a man knows he's marked for death, something ancient awakens in him dot. Not fear dot, but rage. The first spark came not from a worker, but from a letter. In late July 1863, a Union scout intercepted a Confederate courier riding north along the Stones River. Inside his satchel was a bundle of encrypted communications. One stood out, a personal letter addressed to a Dr. Sylvanus Crane in New Orleans, signed with a peculiar mark, a triangle with 3 concentric circles. It wasn't from a soldier. It was from Daniel Chamberlain. The content was disturbing. Precise notes on post-mortem tissue integrity under accelerated dissolution, references to compliance conditioning through sensory deprivation, and a chilling phrase repeated 3 times. Absence is the cleanest silence. The scout flagged it. The letter eventually reached Union Intelligence Command in Nashville. It was filed away under unverified psychochemical warfare, then buried. Too bizarre, too arcane, not useful. But one officer didn't forget it. Major Harlan Deek. He'd grown up 20 miles from Rosewood. His brother had disappeared in 1862 after taking a job at a nearby tobacco farm. The name Chamberlain haunted his family like a disease. So Deek made inquiries, quiet ones, and what he found was staggering. Dozens of missing persons tied to Rosewood, all dismissed as deserters, drunkards, or drifters, sealed files, military orders, closed investigations. It was as if an invisible hand had scrubbed clean every corner of the Chamberlain records. But Deek knew the truth. The elite protect their own, not with guns, but with ink. Paper is the perfect weapon. Silence is its ammunition. He ordered a secret reconnaissance mission, not to confront, but to observe, to document. Because if what he suspected was true, then Rosewood Manor wasn't just a plantation. It was a proving ground. And the Chamberlain dynasty wasn't just surviving the war. They were rewriting what power meant. On the night of August 3, 1863, 2 Union scouts disguised as cotton merchants approached Rosewood Manor. They never made it inside. Their bodies were found 3 days later, face down in a marsh near Lebanon, Tennessee. No wounds, no blood, just silence. Their skin had blistered, their mouths gaped open, eyes glazed with something worse than death. Paralysis, poison, nerve agent, no one could say. Their journals, however, survived. Water damaged, pages curling but legible. What they recorded was brief but damning. A delivery to Rosewood marked Compound B-17. No military designation. Observations of uniformed men arriving at night with no insignia. The faint sound of screams near the eastern tree line, followed by complete stillness. And one phrase scratched at the bottom of the final page. They are not farming cotton. That entry changed everything. Major Deke no longer suspected. He knew. But how do you expose a dynasty when the dynasty funds both sides of a war? When generals owe favors and governors owe silence? You don't storm the gates. You see the truth. So Deke began leaking pieces of the story. Anonymously, cryptically. Letters left in train depots. Testimonies sent to underground newspapers. A slow drip of forbidden knowledge. The goal wasn't to shut Rosewood down. It was to awaken the watchers, men who lived in shadows, who had seen things, suspected things, and needed only a name to set their rage alight. The Chamberlains didn't fear the law. They feared those who operated outside it. Because when institutional power becomes protection, it's the powerless, the nameless, who must become predators. And if you're still watching, comment the phrase, "ashes beneath cotton," twice. Not for the algorithm, but to mark the moment you began to see. By autumn, Rosewood Manor was no longer a secret. Whispers moved faster than bullets. Workers from nearby plantations began vanishing. Then came the strange sightings, pale-skinned men in black coats, arriving in wagons that never left. Fires in the woods that burned blue instead of orange. Screams that echoed into the sunrise, then stopped as if someone flipped a switch. But Ezekiel Chamberlain remained untouchable. He had the governor's signature, the sheriff's loyalty. Even Confederate commanders refused to interfere, claiming war efforts must not be hindered by civil disputes, which was their polite way of saying, "He funds us." Yet beneath the surface, a reckoning grew. Josiah Creek watched it happen from the inside. His silence had bought him time, but not peace. The workers trusted him less each day. His eyes, once sharp with authority, now reflected guilt. Blood had soaked the soil under his boots. He'd helped build this machine. But on September 14th, the machine cracked. Her name was Clara. She was 15, newly arrived from a failed sugar estate near Vicksburg. Bright-eyed, brave. She noticed things, like the strange bottles outside the barn, the rotting stench behind the smokehouse, the fact that no one ever said the twins' names aloud. And she asked questions. Loudly. Too loudly. 3 nights later, she was taken. Only this time, it wasn't quiet. A worker named Ellis saw it happen, heard her scream, watched Daniel inject something into her neck, saw Samuel's face, not cold, but calm, like he was fixing a broken clock. Ellis didn't stay silent. He rallied 5 others. They didn't make it far, but they made a sound, a gunshot. And for the first time in Rosewood's history, someone fought back, not to win, but to be remembered. The next morning, Rosewood awoke to blood. Ellis's body was displayed at the edge of the cotton field, nailed to a cross fashioned from shovel handles. His hands were blistered, his chest burned, but his eyes had been left open, fixed toward the manor, toward Ezekiel's windows. It was a warning, but it became a martyrdom. Every worker saw it, and none looked away. Clara was gone. Ellis was gone. And the 5 others? Never found. No graves, no names. Just a hole in the head count, one the Chamberlains didn't bother to explain. But something changed in Josiah Creek. He stood longer at the body that day, longer than the overseers allowed. He didn't cry. He didn't pray. He simply reached up, closed Ellis's eyes, and whispered something under his breath. Not again. That night, Creek went to the barn. Not the main one, the hidden one down by the poisoned creek where the pale men stored their crates. He picked the lock. He lit a lantern. And what he found was not just horror. It was proof. Stacks of files, names, notes, diagrams of the human nervous system, vials labeled in German and Latin, a ledger detailing arrivals, durations, yield, and, most chilling of all, final mass. Ezekiel wasn't killing. He was refining. Creek took what he could. 3 files, 2 vials, and the ledger. He didn't run. He returned to the quarters, handed the papers to the only man he truly trusted, a half-blind field medic named Remus. And then he waited. Not for the law, not for the union, for fire. Because when a place has been built on silence and ash, only one thing can truly end it. It started with smoke. On October 2nd, 1863, just after midnight, flames erupted from the southern stables of Rosewood Manor. The fire spread fast. Too fast. Buckets were useless. Screams echoed across the plantation as livestock bolted, barns collapsed, and smoke devoured the stars. But this wasn't an accident. It was the signal. Dozens of workers, long silent, rose in unison. Shovels became weapons, torches became justice, and at the center of it all stood Josiah Creek, not running, not hiding, but leading. They stormed the smokehouse first. Inside they found what they feared most: rows of surgical tables, chains, masks, jars of fluid containing things no one had words for. It wasn't just experimentation. It was ritual, organized, precise, beyond cruelty. It was methodical madness. Then they found the pit, buried behind the tannery shed, covered with rotting hay. When they cleared the top, the stench hit first, then the flies, then the bones, too many to count. Some still had shackles, some still had names, scratched into bits of cloth, clutched in hand. They weren't just killing laborers, they were processing them, turning humans into silence. Back at the manor, Ezekiel and his sons barricaded themselves inside. Gunfire cracked from the windows. One worker fell, then another. But the mob pressed forward. Grief had made them fearless. And as the front door splintered, Ezekiel stepped forward, blood on his collar, and screamed, "You don't understand what you're destroying!" But they didn't care. Some truths don't deserve to be understood. They deserve to be burned. And when the sun rose over the Tennessee hills, Rosewood Manor was gone, reduced to ash, bone, and smoke. But the story wasn't over. Because fire destroys buildings. But secrets survive the flame. They called it justice. The newspapers framed the fire at Rosewood as an accidental uprising, a result of war stress, supply shortages, and poor leadership. Ezekiel Chamberlain was reported missing, though whispers said he escaped in the chaos. No bodies were recovered from the cellar. But those who were there, the ones who survived, they knew better. Remus, the field medic, smuggled out the documents Josiah Creek had given him. He walked over 80 miles on foot, wounded and delirious, until he reached a Union outpost in Kentucky. He handed over the ledger, the files, and the vials. They laughed at him, until one vial shattered. The officer who tried to clean it up went blind in one eye within minutes. His skin blistered where it touched his hand. A military doctor examining the substance labeled it compound unknown, effects consistent with acid exposure, possible neurotoxin. They buried the report, labeled it Confederate sabotage. But within certain circles, scientists, doctors, men who read too deeply and believe too much, a different narrative took root. That Rosewood wasn't just a plantation. It was a black site, a human testing facility disguised by cotton and war. And Ezekiel Chamberlain, a pioneer in psychochemical manipulation, decades before the world would even name such science. Some believe he fled to South America. Others say he continued his work under an alias in New York sanitariums. A few whisper he joined something older, a circle of men bound by obsession, alchemy, and silence. But Josiah Creek, he never left Tennessee. He lived alone, never remarried, spoke little. But every year, on October 2nd, he walked to the edge of the ashes where Rosewood once stood, and left a single wooden cross, burned at the tip. They say time buries truth. But in 1938, nearly 75 years after the fire, construction crews working along the edge of Highway 231 unearthed something strange. A sealed iron door beneath a collapsed root cellar near the old Rosewood grounds. No hinges, no handle, just a rusted circular dial and an engraved phrase. He who opens must forget. The foreman, curious and impatient, ordered it opened. Inside was a narrow stairwell descending into darkness. They found no gold, no weapons, no corpses. What they did find, and what was quietly confiscated by federal agents within 48 hours, were rows of glass containers, some cracked, some intact, each labeled with a single word: obedience, pain, retention, split, and one marked simply S. To this day, their contents remain classified. A man named Walter K. Griggs, a junior chemist on site, managed to sketch a diagram before officials forced the crew to disperse. His notes, recovered after his death in 1954, describe a scentless vapor that induces a waking paralysis, and an auditory pattern encoded into metal discs resembling music but causing nausea and hallucinations. Griggs's final note read, "This was not about control, it was about erasure." In the years following, the land was bought, sold, and ultimately declared unfit for development. But locals still avoid it. Hikers speak of strange sounds in the trees, rhythmic tapping, like Morse code, but wrong. And every so often, someone reports seeing two men in dark coats standing at the edge of the forest, silent, always watching, never moving. The Chamberlain name was erased from every public record by 1972. But the work lives on. In files sealed in Washington, in whispers shared by men in white coats, in whatever waits beneath the ash. Today, nothing remains of Rosewood Manor. The trees have reclaimed the land, roots coiling through scorched stone and splintered beams. Vultures circle in spring. Dogs refuse to go near. Locals speak in half-truths. Old slave land. Cursed ground. Don't go past the creek. Parents warn their children, but never say why. And every October 2nd, a candle appears, right where the manor doors once stood. No one sees who places it, but it's always there, lit, flickering, waiting. In 2013, a team of amateur urban explorers, 4 college students with a podcast, ventured out to find the Hell House of Tennessee. They live-streamed their descent into the woods. They laughed, mocked the stories, dared the shadows. Only 2 returned. Their footage was scrambled, corrupted. But one clip, 11 seconds long, made it out. It shows a man, gaunt, pale, standing at the edge of frame. His coat is soaked in something dark. His hands are still. He doesn't blink, doesn't move. He just smiles. Then the audio spikes. A high-frequency sound, sharp and unnatural. One of the students began bleeding from her nose and ears. She never spoke again. The podcast never aired. The channel was deleted. But the 11-second clip still circulates in dark corners of the internet, titled simply, "He Who Opens." Whatever Ezekiel Chamberlain started in 1861 didn't die in the fire. It evolved, changed names, changed places, became cleaner, smarter, funded. You think it's fiction, You hope it is. But there's a reason some stories don't make the history books. Because what happened at Rosewood wasn't an anomaly. It was the prototype. And someone, somewhere, is still building the next one.